Welcome to the Stumbling Spirit, contemplations on the path of resilience. Whether you realize it or not, you are resilient. It's your birthright. As you take in your next breath, know this truth. It's not only about your capacity to overcome difficult situations, but it's about your courage to do the necessary work to heal, learn, grow, and move forward. What you gain is invaluable wisdom. And it's through these hard stumbles in life that we often discover a new purpose that aligns with our spirit. My name is Fabio da Silva Fernandez, Reiki Master, Mindfulness Coach, and Mystical Explorer. Join me weekly as the Stumbling Spirit podcast highlights the lives of extraordinary people like you, sharing transformative stories and beneficial practices of resilience to guide you on your wellness journey. Set in the spring of 1973, Lost Village is a riveting story of what happens when a displaced town, robbed of its identity, is confronted with its fakeness and deadly secrets. It's about the inhabitants who struggle to be themselves and tell the truth, and those who are determined to ruin and silence them, including blackmail and murder. Leading the charge of authenticity in the fictional Ontario town of Kanawaki are three smart boys, Mark, Seb, and Flix, teens who neither fit in at school nor with small-town life, but jam together as bandmates. Bonded by their quirkiness and love of glam rock, they join forces to outsmart a vicious killer and uncover the truth in this Canadian murder mystery. In his debut novel, Michael Saver bravely explores the theme of sexual identity in the face of good and evil. It's a pleasure to welcome my longtime friend, Michael Saver, to the show. Hi, Michael.
Thank you, Fabio, and thank you for that great introduction. That's a great start to our conversation.
Well, you're welcome, and I'm so happy that you're on the show. So let's talk about lost villages. So this is a real thing whereby in creating the St. Lawrence Seaway, they had to destroy towns or move them. Can you tell a little bit about that history?
Yeah. So this is very much a part of the 1950s approach to progress. It was recognized that in order for goods from the Great Lakes to go downriver to the port of Montreal and further on into the Atlantic Ocean, or for goods to come the other way, because the St. Lawrence had a number of places where there were really significant rapids, there were barriers essentially to any kind of large vessel. They had, in the 19th century, created a series of canals that ran along the bank of the St. Lawrence, essentially from Montreal almost to Prescott, Ontario, which is near Brockville. And of course, further on, there would also be having to get around Niagara Falls. But this stretch of the St. Lawrence particularly was problematic, which led then to them having to offload things onto barges and then take them up and then load them onto Lakers to go further on and vice versa. In the 19th century, that was fine. But as the 20th century progressed and more goods traveled globally, Canada in particular felt that there was a need to open up the St. Lawrence. The Americans were a little bit not so sure about that because it was going to cost money to do this, and it was also going to significantly change some things. For example, the Erie Canal in the United States dealt with getting around the St. Lawrence. That was going to really have an impact on what was happening there. So they weren't so sure about this. But there was a lot of back and forth, and the Americans were convinced to buy onto it because Canada essentially said, if you don't, we'll just go ahead and do it. So they wanted to have some control. The issue became that in order to expand the St. Lawrence for ocean-going vessels to come up and down, they were going to have to flood a fairly significant area particularly between Cornwall, Ontario, and Iroquois, Ontario. And in that area, on the Canadian side, there were 11 villages. Some of them were larger, like Morrisburg was about 2,000 people. Some of them were kind of much smaller. But the thing was, they were very old villages. That was the part of Ontario that was first settled. Largely United Empire loyalists had settled in these villages, so they were very old right after the American Revolution. And they knew that they weren't going to be able to move everything. Some of the buildings, again, because of their age, were just not able to be moved, like churches and schools and municipal buildings. They were going to have to move cemeteries. There was a lot that they were going to have to do, but they felt that, well, at least the governments felt that this was a worthwhile thing to do. They were small villages, and so it wasn't a large population. Although, again, when you're talking about 11 villages, there's a significant number, thousands of people being displaced, thousands of people losing connection to their history, to their roots, to where their families had been for almost 200 years. And so it was a significant thing, especially for the people who lived there. So yeah, they built these giant cofferdams to hold back the river as they were doing the excavation. They built locks, they built other control dams. And then in 1958, they blew the cofferdams and the water filled into a very large area that then covered all or part of those 11 villages. The village I grew up in was moved completely. They didn't keep any part of it because it was very much on the bank of the river. They moved it back essentially about I guess a half mile or so. You can still see the river from the town, but it was moved enough that it also had an impact on the relationship, I think, that the town had to the river. Anybody who's grown up on a body of water knows that relationship with water is a really important thing for humans. There's, I guess, maybe because we're made up of water so much, there's just something about the connection with water. And the river, the St. Lawrence River, because it's an important river on the globe, it's a big river, it really was something that had determined a lot about life in these villages. And so losing the connection to that was also a part of losing connection to their history, to the places where their families had lived and died. And they found themselves then in villages that came into being in the middle of the 1950s. This really was probably the largest engineering project, certainly of the 50s, but it would be among the largest of the 20th century. The buildings they could move, what would happen is a house mover would come along. And so you would leave your house in the morning. They would pick the house up off of its foundations on this mover, and then it would very slowly move to the new location in the town. Usually that could happen within a day and a half. And they would set it down on its foundations, they would hook it up, and people would then just go in, and there they were in their house in the new town. What was interesting is that people didn't even pack things really. They just left them the way they were. And these movers were really so skilled at moving the building without damaging anything. This was something that was quite amazing about it, the marvels of technology. The interesting thing in the town where I grew up, and this was true of a number of the villages, they were moved into an area that essentially was farmers' fields. And so there were no trees in the village. And so even though the village looked brand new, right, and all of the municipal buildings were new, the churches were new, it was all, the schools were new, it was all new, but there weren't any trees. Now, when you go into these villages, they're beautiful. Like, I mean, the trees have matured, but for a lot of the time when I was growing up, they looked odd in that sense. The other thing that was odd about them is that some houses couldn't be moved. And so on a typical street, you would have a house that was moved sitting beside a house that was brand new, 1950s bungalow type. So you've got a Victorian house, you've got a bungalow. Maybe you've got a stone house from the early 19th century because it was already there. And so it wasn't moved. And so the towns were an odd kind of mixture of old and new sitting together in this whole new configuration. Largely the towns lost their stores, right? Because the stores and the businesses and these kinds of things were all situated alongside the river. And so the towns also then got shopping centers to replace what had been essentially a main street.
Kanawaki is a fictional town, but you were just mentioning that you grew up in one of these displaced towns, and you were talking a little bit about what happened in your specific town and how there was a mixture of old and new, and how there was a disconnect with the body of water that it used to stand beside. I'm just wondering if you could talk about some of your personal experience in being raised in a town like that.
My grandfather was a merchant and he was also on the town council. So he was very much involved in the movement of the town and helping people to deal with that. People didn't really have a lot of choice. Like, the government just basically said, we're going to do this and we're going to expropriate your land. My grandfather was very much kind of a community leader. My father followed him in business. And so my family were merchants in the town. And my dad was an only child. I'm an only child. And so I guess what I would say is I grew up feeling very much like I belonged in this town, and I didn't. And so this, I think, was one of the things that led me to want to explore this story fictionally, was to try to make some sense about my experience. Certainly, the thing that made me feel disconnected from the town, aside from the whole experience of it being like a town that didn't belong there in some ways, was that I very early on knew that I was different. It was only in adolescence, I think, that I began to understand that that was gay. But I knew when I was 6 years old that there was something different about me and the way that I looked at the world. Certainly in the 1950s and 60s and early 70s, when I was growing up there, that was not something that was acceptable. It is not something, there were no role models. The kind of people that you might have seen in popular media who were identified as gay or queer or homosexual, or the various things that people said in those days, were not people that you would want as role models. I never thought that I was like Liberace or something. There was, so you're trying to figure out who you are in a context in which it's not acceptable to be who you are. And I did experience quite a bit of bullying. I think people could tell that I just didn't fit, and people who don't fit become kind of easy targets. So yeah, it was a strange experience of feeling connected and not connected. And I think this is what really led me to want to explore that and how other people in that town undoubtedly felt the same kind of connection and disconnection. So while it began, I think, in some ways as a bit of therapy for me about my upbringing, it became something bigger for me in terms of the human experience of connection and disconnection, the paradox of that.
You mentioned bullying. Bullying is a major theme in your story. What is also a theme is small town life and how secrecy and gossip pervades small town life. So I'm wondering what more you can share about that idea.
It's interesting that there's an incredible gift and an incredible challenge of life in small towns. And I think this may be where people will connect with the book, even if they have no knowledge about the St. Lawrence Seaway and this kind of displacement or whatever. But oftentimes in community, the smaller and the more interconnected and insular a community is, the gift of that is that people can experience support and caring, like when someone dies or if someone's sick or whatever, like there's a willingness to care actively. And being that interconnected, being that insular, means that everyone knows everybody else's business. And so there's the paradox, right? Like, I mean, knowing everyone else's business means that when it's needed, you can provide the kind of caring that's needed, and you also can presume to have opinions about somebody else's life and the way they are, the way they raise their kids, and you know a lot of details about people. I've lived most of my life now in a very large city. That's not the case here. I live on a floor in a building and I know the names of a few people, but I don't know anything else about their lives. That's very different in a small town. People know, and they know stuff about your history, right? Your family's history, even. One thing in the novel I talk about is that growing up, there were families that had been there from the beginning, right? And then there were families that were more come latelys, I would call them, right? So people knew that maybe your family had come just one generation back. And so, like, they're not quite, here yet. And then there were what we would call visitors, right? Which is people who perhaps had just come recently. And are they going to stay? Are they going to be part of this community? So it was very much kind of people knew a lot about each other. And again, that had gift and challenge to it for sure. And I experienced that, especially as some people decided that I was too different.
One of the things I really enjoyed about your book is all of the Canadian references. And where the story begins is with something that is quintessentially Canadian, which is Victoria Day. And for our listeners, Victoria Day is a Canadian statutory holiday commemorating the crown, Victoria referring to Queen Victoria. So what I found interesting about choosing Victoria Day is, we talk about the fakeness of the town, but the holiday itself is kind of fake as well because we don't really celebrate the royal family. We just get together and drink a 2-4 of beer and spend time with friends and family and maybe open a cottage if we have one. So I found it really interesting that you used that as a device in your story.
it's part of my own memory as well that Victoria Day was like the start of the summer in some ways, right? It was after that point in May, things tended to get warmer. And so it seemed like a really good time to begin the story. But I agree with you 100%. I call it now our colonization holiday because essentially thinking about celebrating what was Queen Victoria's birthday is really quite ridiculous. Now, of course, I guess one could say that Queen Victoria being the monarch when Canada as a dominion came into being in 1867, et cetera. Like, I mean, I guess that there's some historical relevance, but I agree with you. It's a holiday that we cling to because it is the start after a winter that is oftentimes really unpleasant. It's the start of a season of summer in Canada that can be absolutely glorious. And I remember a lot of Victoria Day weekends with friends doing stuff, camping, or if it was warm enough, actually your first opportunity to take a dip in the perennially cold St. Lawrence. So, yeah.
I don't want to give too much away about your story, but we are anchored in the story with a murder. And there
Mm-hmm.
are a couple of murders in this story. We talked about bullying, but there's also a lot of other themes in your story related to corruption. I talked about secrecy, gossip. There's general recklessness in terms of how certain institutions within the town conduct themselves. And I know this is a fictional story, and you kind of referenced it in talking about your own personal experiences, but I am wondering, what is it that you can tell us about the events of your own upbringing that inspired you to write this story?
Yeah, it does begin with a murder. There were several murders took place when I was growing up in Eastern Ontario that were particularly disturbing. Again, this is a work of fiction, and so I took some of that experience that I had relating to the uncertainty, the upset that happened, and have fictionalized it. But I do remember that there was a murder took place that really did in some ways change the town. People had been sitting out on their porches and there was a lot going on oftentimes in the early evening. After the one murder I remember, people locked their doors, which had never been the case. People didn't sit outside. There was an impact on, if you like, the assumed trust that there was in the community was seriously damaged by this murder. And this is what I fictionalized in the first murder that happens in the book. And it also, without giving too much away, it had impact on my own family. And so I explore that a bit in some of the details that happened to those characters were things that were very similar to what had happened in my own family. And so again, I used that as a stepping off place to explore what was the impact on a community in a broader sense.
There's a lot of tension in your novel from various perspectives. There's a tension relation to generational differences.
Mm.
There's differences in ideologies, differences in music in terms of what people like or what people perceive as subversive. And
Mm-hmm.
there's also a tension in terms of the ways people show themselves to the world as well. And then if you're Canadian, we all know that there's a continual tension between English and French. And so that also plays in your novel as well. What else can you tell us about all of these tensions within your book?
In some ways, they're normal parts of the 60s and 70s. The clash, I think, between conservatism, the way that family and community was defined in the 50s, and some of the tension that arose by people in the 60s and early 70s who just basically said, we don't fit here. It showed up certainly, obviously, in racism in the United States in particular, although again, also here in Canada, we just didn't talk about it as much. Certainly the roles of women, what we now would understand as LGBTQ plus plus. There was no place for anyone who identified in that kind of way. And so the closet was really the norm for people who were self-identifying like that. There was the relationship between Canada and the United States. So, for example, and in my second book, one of the things I explore there is the experience of draft dodgers who came to Canada and again found here a safe haven in some ways, and in other ways, not so much because of being an outsider and the suspicion sometimes that there was of outsiders in smaller communities. Music was always interesting because music for me was one of the ways that I was able to survive and thrive was through music. And I was always interested in stuff that would be a lot more on the edge than what you would typically have heard. We had in Canada Canadian content rules. And so a lot of what was played on the radio was not anything that had any edge to it. It was all pretty straightforward, simple, poppy kind of stuff. Whereas I got very much interested in music that was pushing boundaries. And so, as you can see here behind me on the picture, David Bowie was a very significant influence in my life in terms of helping me to identify as queer, as different, and that there was somebody who was interesting and creative and somebody that you actually might want to emulate as a role model about difference. And yeah, there was a lot of tension around even at dances, or if you went out to see a band, what they played would determine sometimes the crowd that would show up. And especially the tension between country music and rock music was quite pronounced in the early 70s. And there was a lot of country music being played. And that was at that time, I've grown to appreciate it, but at that time, it was something that definitely didn't connect with who I felt I was at the time. My father loved country music. Maybe that's part of it. So,
I'm glad you brought up Draft Dodgers. This story is set in the early 70s, as we talked about, and you make reference to various issues of the time, including the Vietnam War and the general counterculture. So, how do you find that that era mirrors what we're going through today?
well, there was definitely in the late 60s, early 70s, there was a split like we're seeing mirrored today between what I would call a reaction to change, to openness, to new identities. So the reaction we're seeing, for example, to what people call DEI is very similar to the reaction that there was to things like music that pushed the bounds, films and plays and things that pushed the bounds of what people felt was appropriate or acceptable. And there was, at that time anyway, like in the United States, Richard Nixon represented this kind of moral majority, he said, the silent moral majority who were the real citizens as opposed to people who were protesting the war, civil rights activists, anyone, women who were advocating for a much more inclusive and expansive role for women in society, and the fear that that generated. I think we're seeing exactly the same kind of thing, this kind of division between people who are fearful that something is being taken away or lost, or that this openness to difference somehow will have a negative impact on them and their lives, as opposed to people who are basically saying, there's no room for us unless we change. There's no room for us unless we think more expansively. It's interesting that I think that there are some real parallels with what we're experiencing now.
To my listeners, what are your thoughts on our conversation? Are you from a lost village? What experiences have you had? Send me your thoughts. Just DM me on Instagram at The Stumbling Spirit. So, the main protagonist in your story is Mark, and
Mm-hmm.
you alluded to the fact that Mark is you effectively in the story, and that he belongs to one of the citizen families in town. And so you were talking about the three groups. So we have the citizens who are effectively the founders. Then we have the come latelys, which are the families that came in after World War II, like Flix's family, whose background is Italian. And then we have visitors like maybe Flash Jones, who you don't know
Mm-hmm.
whether they're going to stay or whether they're going to go. So Mark is going through an identity crisis of his own in dealing with his sexuality. He's being bullied in school because they say that he's not manly enough. Why did you want to explore sexuality as a theme in your story?
The novel started as a kind of therapy for me. I think I really wanted to look back on my experience of growing up through that to understand the impact that that had on who I am today, to kind of really see the through line, but also how the things that happened, the decisions that I made really led to the interesting life journey that I've had. And I also wanted to think about how might it have been different. This was something that emerged as I began to say, okay, maybe this story isn't just for me, right? This isn't just me doing some journaling about my adolescence and my growing up in a small town, but maybe this is a bigger story than that. And so I wanted to look and say, how might it have been different? I didn't have a significant other when I was growing up in that town. Like, I mean, I had friends, but I wanted to envision how might that have been if I had had someone who identified in a similar kind of way. What might that have been like? How could it have been possible during that time? Maybe what would have needed to happen for that kind of relationship to develop? I don't want to give too much away, except to say that that is part of the story. And that there are, again, others that are really uncomfortable with anything that would be overt around relationship between those of same gender. Yeah, so that was part of, I think, how the story evolved. And how might that have been different then for me in terms of my own life journey?
What's really interesting about your exploration of homosexuality, bisexuality, queerness in general is that the topic of chosen family also comes to the surface
Mm,
as well.
mhm,
And Mark
mhm,
has his chosen family in
mhm,
Seb and Flix and
mhm,
Flash and
mhm.
others. And it's also important to him because he doesn't have his parents. His
Yeah.
parents are off in Alberta. tending to a family business and he is staying with his grandmother. So he's dealing with not having his real family with him, or at least his parents anyway, and he's having to navigate his teenage life with his chosen family.
Yeah, that's interesting that you pick up on that, Fabio. It's one of the elements that's actually kind of true about this is that that whole question about where the family was going to be, the biological family was going to be located, really is based on the fact that at one point it looked like my father was going to buy a ranch in Alberta, and that's where we were going to go. And I mean no disrespect to Albertans, but the only thing that I could imagine worse than would have been to have been taken to a ranch in Alberta at that point in my life, where with the isolation that would have gone with that. My father didn't choose to do that, but again, it was one of those questions about how might it have been different if this was what had taken place. And the character of Mark then stays behind, or we hope he stays behind. Again, that's one of the things that is a question in the book, is whether he's going to have to end up going with his parents. And chosen family is a very important thing to me, without in any way denigrating biological families. My experience has been, I guess, as an only child of an only child, that chosen family has been very important to me. We don't have a large biological family. And so those who have I've really identified as brothers and sisters and close relatives are people who have been chosen as part of my family. And I think I'm not the only one who experiences that. I think there are lots of reasons why people may get disconnected from a biological family or don't have a biological family of any significance because of things that have happened. And family is important. I think family is what enables us to learn how to love and to get out of our own way sometimes, to be there for one another. And we have to learn that in some ways. And I think for many of us, chosen families where we've really learned how to do that.
Family is important, and it's important to Mark, not only in his chosen family, but he has a very special relationship with his grandmother, who he calls Gran. And we talked about the tension between generations, but the tension is absent between them. And she serves as somewhat of a mentor and someone that he can go to for support. So, why was this an important element to your story?
I had the experience growing up that there were some significant women of that generation who were mentors for me. And they're kind of coalesced into the figure of Mark's grandmother, Gran. She also resembles my mother in many ways today, my mother today in particular. My mother is 93, but if I took her back about 20 years, that's where Gran would be. But I can think of several women in my life journey of that generation who really mentored me, encouraged me, accepted me for who I was. The wisdom of their own life story was just something that I have learned from, and I wanted to honor, I think, in some ways, in the character. And there's several women of that generation in the story who also, I wanted to say, in small towns, oftentimes they're the leaders, right? They're not oftentimes in the formal leader positions, but they are the leaders in the town in terms of helping people to be their best selves. Yeah, so I really wanted to honor that has been my experience. And oftentimes women doing the hard lifting and often ignored but providing leadership in those kinds of ways that just go around the obstacles of the man, So, yeah, and I hope that readers will find that those women are really an interesting part of the story as well.
You could have approached the story from many different perspectives. Why did you choose to do it from a teenager's perspective and not from one of those women?
I've done a lot of thinking about that. I think possibly because the story started with me kind of exploring my own experience, and so therefore, being a teenager at that time, the character of Mark kind of began to emerge. I look back over the various iterations of this novel because it did change significantly over the time. I had a great editor after the first version of this who said to me, "You have two books here and you've got way too many characters." And so it really helped me to start to say, what is the story that I want to tell? And it was then a story about someone trying to figure out who they are in the midst of a town that is struggling to figure out who they are. And I think that whole question of identity and really emerging as who you are is the project of adolescence, right? It's the time in life when that is most clear to us that this is a large part of what we're doing is figuring out how we're not just extensions of the parental unit, right? We are unique, we are different, and how does that difference get lived out? And I think this is why then the teenagers become the central characters. There are others, right? Like, I mean, I think the police, the doctor, like, I mean, there are other characters who I think are really critical to the story and are interesting in themselves. But I think everybody is on the same kind of journey. It's just particularly focused in the novel on the journey of the teenagers to self-discovery. But everybody is figuring out that maybe things are not as they seem. And there's more going on beneath the surface, both individually but also collectively.
Part of that journey is played out through music, and we see this
Mm-hmm.
in the friends, Mark, Flix, and Seb, and Flash with their own band by the very name of their nickname, which is the Smart Boys.
Mm-hmm.
And you use music as a device to show the contrast of ideals and identities within this story. I know that you said that you personally had a connection to music and certain kinds of music and your connection with David Bowie, but why was it important for you to use music as a device in your story? So that's the
Mm-hmm.
first question. And then what went into your song choices?
Well, I think it really was rooted in the fact that the one thing that really helped me to embrace a different identity was the music I was drawn to. I identified strongly with it. I shared musical taste with some of my friends. Any of them would say to you that what they remember in common is us getting together and listening to music. And so, in fact, several of my friends did have a band. I did a set with that band where I sang some of these songs. So that morphed into something a lot more substantial for the Smart Boys, but it was part of my adolescence for sure, was that love of music and playing that music live. And the choices, and this is an interesting piece about the book, I originally had lyrics starting every chapter. Like I had picked a song that I felt related to the chapter. I had the lyrics, and then I discovered that this was just not going to happen because to get permission to quote lyrics is very, very difficult. And when you do get it, it's very expensive. So I thought, okay, I'm not going to be able to do that. I had to take them out. I can refer to song titles, and you will see that there are song titles in the book. On my website, I have a playlist of stuff that they were listening to. If readers are interested, they can search out those songs themselves. But they were bands that I think now, whether it's David Bowie or Lou Reed or Roxy Music or Iggy Pop, these were all bands that really were pushing the envelope, looking at what I would say is the other side of hippiedom. Like hippiedom was very much, peace and love. And it was very heteronormative. It was very, interestingly, while it was counterculture, there was a uniform, right? You had to dress a particular way. There were bands that you like, I mean, Led Zeppelin, that you had to love Led Zeppelin, right? And so these other musicians were kind of looking at the experience of being an outsider to that. And this to me, I think, was definitely something that I was exploring myself. Is that, and I did, I loved Led Zeppelin or Black Sabbath or whatever, Alice Cooper, like all these bands that were more kind of a mainstream. But it was the bands that said, who doesn't fit there? Who is maybe looking at this music and saying, I'm not sure it speaks to me? Those were the ones that I was drawn to. And it was interesting in our friendship circle, we loved both, right? Like, I mean, we listened to Led Zeppelin and we listened to David Bowie. So music is very much still is an important part of my life, but in that time in particular, a very important part of the friends who are featured in the story.
Well, it bonded them together, but as you said, they were outsiders. So for Mark, it was because he wasn't manly enough. For Seb, it
Mm.
was because he was a hippie. For
Yeah,
Flicks, it was because he hung out with the both of them.
yeah.
So, and those were just the teens. There were other people that were dealing with bullying as well. And so it's something that I found very interesting how you were able to weave the theme of bullying throughout the generations so that it wasn't only about the teenagers experiencing it. So, what can you share about that aspect of the story?
It's been my experience that a lot more people had grown up with exclusion in some way. I think that we have this notion that most people kind of fit, and then there are a few people who are othered. I think there's a lot more of us are othered, and very few people actually fit what's considered or called normal. I also wondered, what is it then that leads people sometimes to not care or be cruel in adulthood, or not stand up for those who are being obviously excluded? And I think sometimes it's the trauma of that in their own lives that leads people to be standoffish, to not stand up where they need to. And I wanted to look at what that looked like for some of the other characters in the story, not just the teenagers who had experienced some similar kinds of bullying in their own growing up. And how did that manifest then in them as adults? And we have some examples of that in the story. I think thus it's always been. We're much more aware of bullying now, I guess. Certainly as an educator, I was very much aware of the impact of bullying. But I think that urge to create an in crowd and an out crowd is, again, it's part of the paradox of humanity, right? We want to be connected and we want to be special. And so it's like trying to hold that is really difficult. And some people in particular who feel very vulnerable create circumstances in which they can be special and other people are othered. And then, of course, you have just people who are essentially psychopaths, right? Who it's going to be all about them no matter what, and so they create exclusionary circumstances around them. Yeah, this is something I'm going to look at more in the second novel as well. And in the second novel, I'm quite interested in looking at how religion and spirituality relates to this. On the one hand, working against the othering, and on the other hand, sometimes really contributing to it.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting theme to explore for sure. What I really enjoyed, and I just want to mention this because I thought it was really powerful for me, the fact that you drew a connection between the town being displaced and something unnatural happening to the energy of the town at a spiritual level that
Mhm.
distorts it to the point of it being on the edge of good and evil.
Yeah.
What can you say about that?
It's interesting as I did my own research because I have my memories, but then I did research also on the whole experience. There were people who left. They could not abide the movement from that place that had been the home of their family for generations and this new entity that came into being. There were people who left. They could not make the move. And this got me thinking about what is it that was lost for them that then said, okay, I can't just go and be a part of this new community. And, one of the characters makes the point that when you lose a connection to history like that, you lose a sense of both good and evil, I think. Because in a community's history, you see both the things where people were able to be loving and kind and caring and open to growth. And you also see the experiences of just the opposite of that. And I think this is why history is so important to us, right? We learn both from our mistakes and from the good choices that we're able to make. When that gets lost, physically it gets lost. I think what happens is there's like a void that takes place in a community. I think that these towns have grown out of that. I think if you went there today, you'd see lovely, beautiful villages where I think now people have recreated a history, right? That now goes back well over 50 years. But at the time, I think that it was like when there's a void, something will fill it. And this, in the fictional town of Kanawaki, what fills it is some horrible, destructive kinds of energy. And that lives out in a lot of different ways, not just in the murders, but in the way that people become very much separated from one another.
Part of the destructive energy that you're talking about ties in with bullying, and it also ties in with secrets and the
Yeah.
extent
Mm-hmm.
to
Yeah.
which people
Mm-hmm.
will try to conceal their secrets, but also the poison of secrets that ultimately tear communities apart.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering if you could talk about that angle to your
Mm-hmm.
story.
In some of the work that I do with largely with educators, but with a lot of people, we talk about what I would call the divided life experience. And that is where how a person is on the outside in their interactions with other people and who they are on the inside become disconnected. And so if you like the real person inside is functioning largely with a mask or with some kind of a facade on the outside. I think that happens in a lot of different cases. I don't want to pick on politicians, but oftentimes I look for the question I ask is this the real person? Or is there some other person behind there, who has different ideas, different values? And so I think this is one of the things that can happen sometimes in a community is that experience of the divided life of not feeling like I can be who I am out in the real world creates a circumstance where secrets develop because people will find ways to get what they want, to be who they are, to do, and oftentimes there's a facade, if you like, and I think in Kanawaki there was almost like the village had a facade, and underneath that there was a whole other experience that was being hidden. I think that happens in lots of different ways in life. I think sometimes it happens in professional communities where, again, what appears to be the reality and what the reality really is are two different things. And people suffer in those circumstances, especially people who can't keep up the facade, right? People who feel compelled to tell the truth. That can be a really painful experience. So I wanted to explore that. I think and again, I don't want to lay this on any of the real towns, the real lost villages, but in Kanawaki, this is something that was true and that I wanted to explore in the story.
Yeah, it's a really interesting element to the story because effectively people's sexual orientation is being used against them. They're being blackmailed. They're forced into a closet. What I find ironic about that is, there are these forces that are trying to control people based on this information, right? And then there are other people, other groups, organizations that are overtly doing things that are corrupt, be it the police, be it the town newspaper that's
Mm.
printing unethical things. So there's this dichotomy between what's out in the open and what is done in a very unethical way versus
Mm-hmm.
what people want to be in terms of their true selves, their identity, but they're being stopped from being able to be themselves.
You've said it very succinctly, Fabio. This was what I wanted to explore. That, and again, I want to stress it's a fictional story. I'm not in any way representing the police or the newspapers or but it is my experience that sometimes the institutions that are supposed to provide leadership, that are supposed to provide truth, that are supposed to act with integrity, sometimes do not do that, but pretend that they do. And to me, the pretense is the thing that causes the great harm. It's when we assume that we can trust and then discover that trust has been completely eroded. That leaves people feeling incredibly vulnerable and it disconnects us from one another in community. I think, if I can't trust anymore what's true, and we're actually well down the road to this, right? If I cannot trust what's true, if you and I cannot agree together on something that is verifiable, then I don't think real community is possible in those circumstances. Like, I mean, again, we may be, it might be utilitarian in the sense that we needed one another in order to survive. But anything beyond that, unless we're able to say what is true, to act with integrity, to act with authenticity, so that you know that the person who is there is not hiding behind, some constructed persona, then these are things that I think are very contemporary issues for us. And, as I started to tell the story, those contemporary issues just went back into my own history and I wanted to explore them there.
It's interesting as you were talking about this, I was thinking about, okay, well, yes, trust is fundamental. There's always a group, though, that's setting the rules in terms of the basis of that trust and how the power shifts from who holds that ability to set the rules. And so that's also another element that is constantly changing and that we're having to deal with.
Yeah, it's about power and control. And when people are not able to be authentically themselves for whatever reason, that makes them vulnerable to people who want power and control. And again, I've seen this play out in lots of different ways in society, in professional circumstances. When there's a lot of people in the closet for one reason or another, that can be easily manipulated and controlled by somebody who can see that and then therefore applies the pressure to people who feel vulnerable and is able to manipulate, able to get things from them in order to stay protected. Yeah, it still plays well. I think it always has been. It's why for me in my work, I guess in my own life journey, that living with integrity has become so important to me. I think the closet experience, and again, there are lots of different reasons why people end up in the closet, not able to kind of say who they are and how they are and what that is. Like, I think that is such a destructive experience to be every day knowing who you are, but not able to really live out of that, to not feel safe enough to be able to say, this is who I am, and this is what I'm about, and these are my thoughts, and these are my insights. That is just, it's half living in many ways. And as I say, I think that for those who want power and control over others, they can manipulate that extremely well. And I've seen that. I've seen that in various circumstances in my own life where someone is able to manipulate a whole community in that way.
One form of power that you talk about in your novel is intuition, and you explore that on various levels. I think it's a perfect segue from what we just talked about, right? Because ultimately, it is something that individually we are meant to explore and cultivate, but you explore on different levels within your novel. And what's interesting is that in relation to the three smart boys, is that it gets them in and out of trouble. So
Yeah,
that's the other thing too.
yeah.
So why was intuition important for you to explore?
I've always felt that the creative spark within us as human beings is connected to intuition. I think it is that we see things, we understand things, we connect with one another on levels that are not always really obvious. I guess in my own life journey, and this might have been part of having to navigate the closet for a large part of my certainly my professional life, is that my intuition was honed because always intuition was the thing that would help me to determine, is this a safe circumstance or not? Is this a place in which I can be fully who I am? Is this a relationship in which I can trust this person? Is this a person who's being authentic with me? And intuition looks for the evidence that lies just beneath the surface, right? It's not just the obvious things that you see, but it's that sense of, how do I feel in this circumstance? It's trusting emotion and imagination. And again, this is, I think, an important part of Mark's growth as a person, is learning how his intuition and imagination become really important in terms of how he understands himself in relationship to Kanawaki and to everything. And as I say in the next book, I lean into that an awful lot more. What does it mean really to finally hone your intuition? And how does that also make him different from his friends? Because they all kind of, you know, Flix is, who really is in many ways his best friend, is very different around that. He's a rational, scientific kind of guy. He loves physics. He's very much about what is real and not real. And so they're different in that sense about their way of sensing what is it that constitutes reality. And they need one another, I think, because of that. That's something I really want to do some more exploration about, because we're not all the same in the way that we approach things like intuition, spirituality, which I also think are connected for sure.
Well, intuition, spirituality, but also intuition and sexuality. And that's
Mm,
something that Mark is exploring in your story. And you really highlight a heartwarming and wholesome love connection that Mark has within your story. And what's beautiful about it is that it's gay. And it's something that I haven't quite read in a coming of age story before. And it was done with such care and sensitivity. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
yeah, thanks. Thank you, Fabio, for saying that and for noticing that. That is exactly what I hoped for. And there were two things, I think. I wanted to go back and say, how might it have been if a young man at that point had been able to fall in love essentially with another young man, and what would that have looked like? What would it have felt like? And again, I think so often when we're exploring human sexuality, we focus so much on the physical element of that. Now, I don't say that there's anything wrong with focusing on the physical element. It's just, it's only one part of who we are as sexual beings and in relationship with others. And so I really wanted to say, what's the full experience of that? And I also wanted to share it for people who stand outside the queer experience, who oftentimes don't understand how it can be that people of a different sexual orientation, people of a different gender identity, that like how those kinds of experiences, what is it like to be inside that? And that's really what I wanted to share with readers, was a coming of age that is not just about physical response, but also about emotional response and a sense of identity and connection. And this is oftentimes what I haven't seen in some of the stories I've read. And so I deliberately wanted to go in a bit of a different direction there. And what was interesting is I did share this book with a book club, and there was an 85-year-old woman in this book club. And when I went to hear the feedback, she said, well, I'm not so much about the gays, but those young men, I really liked how their relationship developed. And I thought, okay, there you go. She something happened for her that she was able to hear that story and not, if you like, react out of the things that the negative things, I guess, that maybe she had internalized about people who are LGBTQ plus plus. So that's what I'm hoping for, maybe, is that it isn't just a novel for people who identify as gay. It's, I hope, a novel for everybody.
I'm really glad that you mentioned that book club anecdote. What do you think we can learn from younger generations?
This is a great question for me because I do want this to be a story that can also speak to people who are in their 20s. It's a different world, like in the sense, Kanawaki, I was constantly aware of how technology has changed our lives because in Kanawaki in 1973, all the technology stuff that we depend on doesn't exist, right? Like, I mean, there are no cell phones. People don't know things instantly. There's a different kind of grapevine where people get their information. Information is not at the heart, although it is kind of, it's not at the heart of society, and yet it is, right? But in a different way than it is today. I really do think that young people who are on their own journey of discovery tell us a lot about ourselves by holding a mirror up to what we're living but are oftentimes not looking at. I guess is the way I would think of it. I certainly learned that as a teacher. I think is that young people oftentimes held a mirror up to say, is this really what you stand for? Is this really what is the truth? Is this really what you want us to learn? And oftentimes, as adults, we're just going, right? Like, I mean, we're just delivering it. We're just, here's the curriculum, here's the truth, here's the way of looking at the world. And oftentimes, we've been discouraged so much from questioning that it's just on a roll. And then young people ask questions. Young people hold up the mirror. Young people say, wait a minute, is this really what you want me to believe? And what does discourage me right now is how disconnected it seems that young people are from our institutions. Now, that in itself is holding a mirror, I think, is telling us something. A lot of young people don't vote. Why? Well, I think they don't trust it. I don't think they trust our institutions. I don't think they trust the way that leadership is chosen. I think there's a lot that we could learn, but it also means stopping telling them and more asking. I think questions are really, in this case, more important than the answers that we're always so concerned about delivering. And I do think that this is one thing, going back to the relationship between Mark and his grandmother. Mark's grandmother listens to Mark. She is certainly a source of wisdom, but she also recognizes that so is he. And that's, I think, a very healthy intergenerational relationship that we could all learn from.
What I find really interesting about what we're living through today in comparison to the time that you write about in your novel is that in the 70s, we could say, in a very general sense, that the younger generation on the whole were more progressive. And today, it's not quite that way. You
Yeah.
made a caveat in what you said, those young people that are doing the self exploration, right? And so I would assume would be the ones that would be more open to seeing the world as it is versus seeing the world through the lens of what they perceive it should be from, I guess, an alt-right perspective or whatever, because we're seeing more young people sign up to that ideology. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, I think again that a lot of that is coming from a sense of fear that develops out of a lack of control. Again, young people look at our institutions and the way that we failed them. It's interesting. In David Bowie's song Changes, he says at one point, "Where's your shame? You've left us up to our necks in it." Well, I think that if that was true in 1971, that's way, way, way more true now. Like, where is our shame? We've left them up to their necks in it. So they look at generations that claimed to be caring for the planet, that cared for people who find themselves economically excluded, people who oftentimes are refugees and come to this country and are then abandoned. I think people look at our institutions, young people do, and say, there's a disconnection between here's the divided life again. What you say and what you do are two very different things. Unfortunately, I think the fear that produces the lack of sense of control makes them particularly vulnerable to those who will say, well, the problem is that there is one right way, there is a certainty about this, there is the real story is that. And they're usually very simple ideas that prefer certain people over others. Even just this backlash we're experiencing about anything that has to do with equity, as if ensuring people's equal access is a problem, is bad, is harming somebody. But I think it's because young people are feeling very much like they've been dropped into it by generations who haven't cared, that therefore let's find a simple solution to this. Let's find something that's easy to live with. Let's maybe I'll be less concerned about others and more about getting mine. I think there's a selfishness that goes with this too that's very disturbing. And I don't completely blame them. I think in some ways we've really set up a circumstance where they're ripe for the picking, so to speak, for people who will use them and manipulate them. Yeah, so it's an important time, I think, for us to be paying attention to this, to listen and to engage.
I was talking earlier about the tension in your book and the collision of ideals and cultures within this community and between communities. And there's also, and this kind of relates to the last question, a kind of conservative versus liberal ideological tension as well. So I'm wondering if you have an idea about whether there is an ideology that prevails in your story.
Yes, there undoubtedly is. My ideology now, as it's evolved over time, has been very much to question and to try to not just look at things without asking, what are we not seeing? What else might there be here? Is this actually the way it is, or are there nuances that need to be made? Like this has increasingly become my ideology, a large part of it influenced by the work that I do. I would say another part of that is the absolute belief in the autonomy and interconnection of human beings. And that's another paradox. It is you and I are absolutely unique individuals and we are interconnected by our biology and our relationship to this planet. And it's a both and. You can't have one without the other. People tend to go to one side or the other of that paradox, either focusing on individual rights and freedoms or on everybody has to be on the same page, and it has to be both. That to me is the way I see the world now. And I think it does probably permeate the story, that tension, if you like, between connected and unique. I wasn't intentionally trying to deliver an ideology, but who I am as a person is who I am as a writer. And so as I did have Mark emerge as a main character and in some ways as a surrogate for my own experience, it's natural, I guess, the way I look at the world is going to be the way that Mark comes to look at it as well.
Let's talk about you as a person. So, how has your personal journey, profession influenced this novel?
So I have had a very interesting journey professionally and personally. I have a master's of divinity, and so I had time where I was looking pretty seriously at being ordained a Catholic priest, being a part of a religious community. I think I always wanted, in some ways, to be involved in education, partly because my experience hadn't been particularly positive, and so I wanted to see how could we create a better environment for learning. That even was a whole journey as I think me becoming more who I am and being willing to live that as that kind of divided life lessened, I think my whole way of thinking about education changed. Less delivery of curriculum and recognizing more that the curriculum lives inside us. It's like the information we use is a tool. It's here is the real stuff is inside of us. And how do we create an atmosphere in which that can be explored and shared and lived, and critical thinking and the importance of critical thinking. So my own journey around that certainly, I think, is reflected in some of the ways that the characters are on their journey toward authenticity and integrity. And it was interesting that one of the editors made the point of saying the work that I do as a courage and renewal facilitator, which really is about creating space and holding space for people to come to a deep and clarified sense of who they are and how to live that in a way that respects and honors and cares for others, that journey is similar to the journey that people are on in the novel. And what was interesting is I hadn't really seen that. It was the point that he made that really made me realize, oh, yeah, well, of course, I guess that makes sense, right? This work that I do now is really important to me. It feels to me like it was work that I was always meant to do. And of course, it's going to show up in anything creative that I do because it's who I am. So I was really surprised and pleasantly surprised when he noted that because my work is important to me. And I'm glad if it's showing up in ways that get people thinking about their own life journey and toward authenticity and living in an undivided kind of way.
What does resilience mean to you?
A number of the characters in Lost Village, and I'm thinking about two of them in particular, really come to a deep understanding of resilience. And it is, again, it emerges from the depth of who we are as human beings, full human beings, with our gifts and our challenges. I think it's interesting. I've come to understand that the definition of humility is knowing both my giftedness and my challenges. I think oftentimes humility is thought of as, don't get too big for your britches, don't focus on your strengths and your gifts, where that's bullshit. Like, I mean, if you only know your sinfulness and your problems, like, I mean, that's not a full human being. So it's knowing both. And I think resilience emerges from that. It is knowing that when something challenging has happened in my life, there is within me a strength and an ability to deal with it. It isn't without pain. There's no resilience without pain and challenge. But there is a recognition that we do have within us the capacity to deal with many things. And I don't want to, because I do think that there is the human experience sometimes of being overwhelmed. And so I don't want to lay resilience on anybody and say, well, if you're not able to deal with it, it's your own fault. I'm not saying that, because I think sometimes the circumstances can be such that without support and care and even intervention, some circumstances can really be almost impossible to deal with. But for many things in life, I believe we have within us the capacity. And part of what helps us is recognizing those times in the past when we have had a challenge and we were able to deal with it, and see that that didn't just reside outside ourselves, with some savior that came and fixed it all for us, but that most of the difficulties in life, we have within us the ability to deal with that. I think that is the journey of the characters in the novel as well, is they are able to deal with the things that happen, and they come to understand that while they need one another, they also have within them a source of strength and resilience.
Reflecting back to your novel, one of the themes that I'm exploring this season is the relationship between resilience and survival. And I find that those two things are very much present in your story. What are your thoughts on that relationship? How they're similar, how they're different?
Survival to me, in some ways, feels like the bare minimum. It's the difference between being here and not being here. It's the difference between being able to move forward or being absolutely stuck in a circumstance like addiction or a disease that cannot be healed or whatever. It's so survival is the ability to go on. But I think resilience is a step further along than just survival. I think it is the ability to make sense of what has happened. I think it is, again, recognizing the inner strength, the inner capacity to do that. Again, because I think people can survive and assume that the reason for their survival has nothing to do with their own capacity. It comes from somewhere else. I think resilience actually looks forward, whereas often survival looks back on the trauma, on whatever it was that happened. I think that we want to do more than just survive. I think we want to make sense of it, to build on it, to grow. Yeah, that's, I guess, the difference that I would see. And I probably have a lot more to say about that if I thought about it some more. So that's a question I'm going to take away with me. That's a really good question.
What are your practices of resilience?
I'm a writer, I'm a journaler, I'm a reflector. When stuff happens, as it oftentimes does, what I like to do is to not immediately rush to a definition of something, but to hold it. I like to explore it with others who will ask me good open questions. I think that the one thing I would say is patience for me and being willing to wait is a resilience practice.
You mentioned the importance of reflection, of having conversations where people can ask you questions, the importance of patience, and the importance of journaling as well. How did these practices benefit you?
Well, I think that, again, a lot of the work I do with folks is creating space for self knowledge to emerge, creating space for people to articulate what's going on inside in a way that it's almost like if you can have it here, you can look at it and understand it. Whereas if it's just buried inside, sometimes it's very difficult to really understand what that is and who I'm called to be and what's really happening for me. And so the practice of reflection, of writing, of asking myself or having others offer to me open questions about that. Again, questions that are not leading me somewhere or telling me what I should think about myself or a circumstance, but allowing that inner knowledge to emerge is really important to me. In the work I do, we believe that each person has within them a source of insight and knowledge. And sometimes people call it the soul, sometimes the true self. My colleague Parker Palmer calls it the being and human being. I truly do believe that. I think that that is also the source of human spirituality. It's the connection that we have with one another. My firm belief that you have within you that same source that I do. They're different because we're different people, but we share that. This to me also then is the source of resilience. It's what the better I can know that, the better I know my capacity and my weakness, because oftentimes when I've found it hard to respond to challenges, it's because I'm not facing my weakness or understanding it. I'm pretending that I don't have a vulnerability that I really do have. So the better I can know that, the better, as I say, oftentimes it's a question of getting out of the way. It's a question of recognizing, oh, this isn't about me. This problem I'm having with this other person, or maybe it is about me. It's about some fear or some doubt within myself that's being manifested in the way that this person is responding. And I think it's about them, but it's really about me. So these are the things that I think that these practices of reflection, of journaling, of being willing to share, but share in a way that the other person is not there to fix and advise you and tell you what you should do, but to help you to know yourself, to know your own capacity, to know your own soul. Yeah, this has become for me an essential part of my life, and it's showing up in my writing.
How can people reach you if they want to contact you? And most importantly, how can they purchase your book?
My website is michaelsaver.com. So Michaelsav like Victor ER.com. That will also, as soon as the book is available, which I'm hoping is sometime in the summer, the information will be on there about the way to get it. There's also a way there to reach out to me if you're interested. Please do. If you have stories about your own experience with lost villages, I'm really happy to hear them because I think we all have stories to tell.
Michael Saver is author of Lost Village, his debut novel. Michael, it was such a pleasure to have you on the show. It was amazing. I really enjoyed our conversation, and I feel like we could have talked a lot longer. I know that it will really connect with people in terms of understanding the importance of being their true selves and being a light in the world. So thank you.
Thank you, Fabio.
Thank you for listening to The Stumbling Spirit, Contemplations on the Path of Resilience. This is Fabio da Silva Fernandez. Join me again next week for another episode of transformative stories and beneficial practices to guide you on your wellness journey. If you wish, you can follow and DM me on Instagram at The Stumbling Spirit. Until next time, take a deep breath and another step forward on your path of resilience.